Wolong Fallen Dynasty. This is a game that I've been highly anticipating for some time now. I've been keeping my eye on it because not only is it a Souls-like, a genre that I've fallen in love with over the past few years, but more specifically, it's a Sekiro-like, and Sekiro happens to be my favorite FromSoft game of all time. It's like between Elden Ring and Sekiro, but there's just something about the combat in Sekiro that just really jive with me, and that game's just got a special place in my heart. So when I heard that the developers of Nioh were working on a game that is going to take inspiration from Sekiro and essentially focus on that pairing mechanic, I was like, yes, sign me up, please be good. And I haven't finished the whole game, but I've played most of it at this point. And I gotta say, this is a really damn good game. If you enjoyed Sekiro, I think you're really gonna enjoy Wolong Fallen Dynasty. And I'd also say that maybe if Sekiro didn't quite jive with you, Wolong might be a more accessible version of Sekiro in some ways. So yeah, let's dive right into this. I'm excited to talk about this one. The combat is up first. This is where I think they really had to nail the mechanics because combat is everything in Sekiro. It is such a fundamental part of the experience, and fortunately, the combat really works in this game. Is really thrilling, really fun, really challenging and exhilarating, and the pairing mechanic, it takes some getting used to. It's not quite as precise as Sekiro's, but pretty damn good, and once you get used to it, you'll feel badass. You feel like a god, and just the way combat is animated and some of the finishers you can pull off and all these things just really gives combat weight and impact. So you've got your standard light and heavy attacks, and you've got your movesets for different weapons, but this being a Sekiro, like again, your primary form of defense will be parrying or deflection as it's known in this game. Now, Sekiro had a dedicated parry button, whereas Wolong combines dodging and parrying into one button. So you can do things like parrying towards a direction, and you can also parry in place by keeping the analog stick neutral and pressing the dodge button. It does take some getting used to, though, because the combination of dodge and parrying means that parry has mobility, which can sometimes screw you over because you might reposition yourself as an enemy attack is incoming, and that repositioning changes the timing of the appropriate time to parry. So I do actually wish this game had a dedicated parry button alongside the dodge parry mechanic. There are times when I wanted to parry while I'm still, but I was like in the middle of moving or running, and so I ended up repositioning myself when I didn't intend to. So there are things like that that makes it not as precise as Sekiro's parry system, and I do think that the animation to parry timing ratio is not as intuitive as Sekiro's, where in Sekiro, the visuals and the timing of the parry makes sense. Sometimes in Wolong, I'm like, wait, it feels like I have to parry way too early given the animation here. In Sekiro, by the time I understand the rhythm of a boss's attacks, I'm able to parry consistently, whereas in Wolong, even if I know the exact rhythm of an incoming enemy or boss attack, there are times where I'm like, I saw it coming and I knew what the timing was, but this time, weirdly, the parry didn't work, whereas previously it did. There were occasional moments like that where I'm like, okay, this is definitely not as precise as Sekiro, but you do get used to it over time, and it's still precise enough where once you do get used to it, you'll be parrying in really badass ways. Eventually, once I mastered this parry system, combat really did start to feel pretty awesome. Occasional, like, bullshit, like, I totally parry that moment aside. And what Wolong especially emphasizes is parrying critical blows, which are these strong attacks that enemies will perform that will be indicated by a red glow that if you don't parry properly and get hit by, you'll likely take significant damage. But if you do parry, you'll perform this cool knockdown maneuver that will stun enemies, and that'll allow you to execute powerful counterattacks that deal massive HP and spirit gauge damage. Let's talk about spirit gauge, because this is one area where I think they did a really cool job on extrapolating on what Sekiro did. This is basically Wolong's version of Sekiro's posture bar, that if it gets chipped away at enough, you'll get stunned. But Spirit Gauge also serves the double purpose of essentially being like a stamina bar that will decrease when you dodge, when you use special weapon skills called martial arts, which are essentially like weapon arts in Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and you can have up to 2 of them at a given time. A weapon can come with up to 2 martial arts at a time. When you use wizard spells, you'll consume Spirit Gauge, with spells being abilities you'll unlock as you level up, and you can have up to 4 at a time via shortcuts, and also your Spirit Gauge will decrease if you take damage from enemies. Now, you can recover Spirit by attacking enemies or successfully parrying their attacks and whatnot, but what separates Wolong's Spirit Gauge from Sekiro's Posture Gauge is that Sekiro's Posture Gauge fills up from 0% to 100%, and if it reaches 100%, you get stunned. Wolong's Spirit Gauge starts at 0, starts at the center, and can go into the negative or into the positive. If the Spirit Gauge goes fully negative, then it's going to break your posture, it's going to stun you. But if you start going to the positive area of Spirit Gauge, not only does that give you extra stamina to perform more martial arts and wizard spells and maneuvers and whatnot, but alongside that, when your Spirit Gauge is at a positive, you can execute more powerful versions of heavy attacks, or spirit attacks as they're known in this game, that will do significant damage to enemies' Spirit Gauge. And yes, enemies also have Spirit Gauge and have sort of essentially the same mechanic that you do, and so combat becomes about this tug of war between your Spirit Gauges, where the goal is to keep your Spirit Gauge in check by attacking and deflecting and keeping it in the positive, while also using martial arts and wizard spells that consume Spirit Gauge tactically and wisely, so that you can chip away at enemy Spirit Gauge and break their posture before they break yours, so that you can stun them and perform powerful and badass finishers called Fatal Strikes, which is similar to Sekiro. And so that tug of war of Spirit Gauges and you having to be skilled enough to be able to counter your enemy's attacks and tactically use your offensive maneuvers that do consume Spirit Gauge, but you can also find ways to gain Spirit Gauge with attacks and deflecting and all these things. That's one way you can gain an advantage on enemies, but also you can execute stealth attacks. You can sneak behind enemies and backstab them, essentially. There is no crouch button in this game, unlike in Sekiro. What you have to do instead to sneak is walk instead of run, tilt the analog stick slightly, and sneak behind enemies. This can actually be very useful, especially in areas with a lot of verticality. You can go on rooftops and descend onto enemies from above, and if you know where enemies are positioned, you can stealth your way through a section, or at the very least deal significant damage to enemies that will give you advantage in combat and make them a lot easier to take down in one-to-one encounters. So yeah, once you master parrying, Spirit Gauge management, tactical use of martial arts and wizard spells, and smart usage of sneak attacks, combat will feel like intense, satisfying, and exhilarating sparring matches. After falling in love with Sekiro, I longed for a Sekiro-like that would capture enough of the essence of that combat system, and Wolong's combat definitely both scratches my Sekiro itch while being distinct enough to feel fresh, to have its own unique identity. There are some flaws worth pointing out, like the occasional camera issues that don't allow you to really see what's going on around you. The default auto-lock settings, I have to point out, absolutely suck. I would recommend changing those settings, because the way it is by default is you'll automatically lock on to the first enemy that you attack or deflect, and that lock-on will stay on them. It won't switch to other enemies you parry, and so oftentimes you might parry a critical blow from an enemy that you're not locked onto, and so you'll counter them and then you'll deplete their Spirit Gauge, and you'd hope that the lock-on would switch to them because they're now stunned and open to counterattack to a finisher. But because the lock-on is stuck, you'll actually attack the wrong enemy. You'll miss the window to do the counterattack to the other enemy that attacked you and who's stunned now, and so the enemy will have a chance to recover. And there were a number of occasions where this auto lock-on system just completely screwed me over and got me killed. There are settings for that, so I'd recommend messing around with that before playing this game and find what's comfortable for you. And then finally, controls customization is something that I had some trouble with, because by default, the light and heavy or spirit attack is set to face buttons, and the way I like to play it is kind of like how Soulsborne and Sekiro does it. I like to set those attacks to the right shoulder and trigger buttons, but the thing is that face buttons are also used for spells, shortcuts, and those shortcuts cannot be customized separately from the button inputs, so my shortcuts kind of got messed up a little bit, and so I had to essentially get used to this weird layout to cast spells. Nothing here that's experience ruining, but some gripes here and there that I think are worth pointing out. Now, one area where I think people might prefer Wolong over Sekiro is the variety of weapons and armor that you can equip. Sekiro was all about mastering the katana, its skills, and the prosthetic tools. There was no equipment system of any kind. You couldn't switch your katana for another weapon. It was just a very strict one-way to play kind of situation. Wolong, on the other hand, is a little Dark Souls in the sense that there are a bunch of weapon types to experiment with, from light and fast to heavy and impactful weapons. There are all kinds of different movesets across swords, sabers, scimitars, spears, javelins, halberds, padaws, staves, maces, clubs, hammers, and more. And I've got to say, the moveset animations look fantastic. There's just this Chinese martial arts flair, and even if you do get two of the same weapon, those two weapons might have different martial arts or weapon arts attached to them. The special skills that are super helpful in chipping away at enemies' spirit gauge, or certain martial arts might allow you to close the distance between you and the enemies, or might give you some kind of AoE attack. Just gives you some kind of tactical advantage. And yeah, I actually found myself switching and trying out different weapons quite a bit, and that just kept combat fresh, and I foresee this paving the road to multiple playthroughs and keeping those playthroughs fresh as well. It was just really cool to experiment with what weapons work with what enemies better, and every weapon felt satisfying for different reasons. Just a wide array of combat styles to try out. You've also got ranged weapons like bows, crossbows, throwing knives, etc. I honestly rarely use those, but occasionally you'll have some really distant enemy who will be a pain in the ass to reach, so pulling out your bow and taking them out, that can be useful on occasions. And then there's armor customization, which not only changes the aesthetic of your character, but also, of course, affects things like how much HP and spirit gauge damage you take. And like in Soulsborne, you have to keep track of your weight, because too much weight will negatively impact things like dodging, as well as spirit gauge consumption when parrying or when using martial arts. And one great feature is that you can unlock transmog in this game, so you can wear the armor that has the best stats, or even the weapons that have the best stats, but change their appearance to the weapons and armor you think look the coolest. Eventually, you can even unlock the ability to access the character creation at any time, mid-playthrough. And speaking of the character creator, this is one of the best character creators I have experienced in a video game. There's just so much customization, and the character models look good. Now, going back to weapons and armor, on top of everything, you've got these passive special effects that essentially allow for additional customization for more nuanced builds. All the weapons and armor you loot have this rarity number, a number of stars, and that essentially equals the number of special effects that can be applied to them. And these special effects can actually be customized at a later point in the campaign, where you can take out special effects and apply your own. I didn't find myself messing with this system too much, but for those who really want to get to the nitty-gritty details of their builds, this is just an extra layer they can experiment with. I do think this game has a problem of just too much loot. Eventually, your inventory will get filled up with all manner of armor and weapons, and I just prefer the Soulsborne way of just finding fewer weapons and armor, but each one feeling unique. I do think that Wolong is better than Neo on that front, but still, there's an excess of loot that just clutters your inventory, and you'll obtain a lot of the same weapons and weapon types. Occasionally, they have different rarities, but more often than not, a lot of the weapons and armor you obtain are going to be ones you're not going to use. You can disassemble them to gain the crafting resources, to embed passive special effects and stuff like that, and you can sell them for copper that can be used to buy consumable items and stuff like that, but it's just managing all that can be a little bit of a pain. Now, obviously, weapon and armor and the ability to upgrade them and all that stuff, that'll be a major part of your progression, but the main form of progression is going to feel very familiar to those who have played Soulsborne titles or Sekiro. In Wolong, you're essentially going to collect the equivalent of souls known as genuine chi in this game. They're earned by killing enemies, and you lose them if you die. Or rather, actually, Wolong is more merciful on that front. You actually only lose half of your genuine chi, and you get them back by slaying the enemy who killed you. And if you keep dying, your genuine chi will continue to be halved. But of course, if you're able to retain your genuine chi, you can spend those to level up. And the attributes in this game are called elemental virtues. You've got 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And each affects different stats like HP, attack prowess, defense prowess, parrying prowess, spirit gain and loss rate, stealth, max weight, you name it. And then on top of that, weapons will have stronger affinities to certain elemental virtues, so it'll affect how much damage your weapons do as well. Kind of like how in Dark Souls, if you build into a Dex build, you want to use Dex-based weapons. And as you level up Wolong's attributes or the elemental virtues, you'll also unlock wizard spell points to spend on spells. These spells are locked behind elemental virtue level requirements. So as you increase a certain attribute, more of that element's spells will become available for you to spend points on. I will say that a lot of spells just don't feel particularly useful because they're often too slow to cast during combat, and their effects more often than not don't tend to be worth the risk you take by casting these spells and leaving yourself open to attacks, but every once in a while, spells can come in handy in a pinch. There's one spell that I use a lot that allowed me to temporarily heal by damaging enemies, and if I could execute fatal strikes while the spell was active, I actually could heal a lot, and I could essentially save myself from using the limited heals that I have per run before I reach the next, bonfire equivalent. And then outside of your stats and attributes, you've got things like weapon and armor upgrades. You'll eventually unlock a blacksmith, and you'll be collecting crafting materials from enemies, lootable chests, or the environment to boost their attack and defense. You've got these things called divine beasts, which are essentially your ultimate abilities. The divine beast gauge fills up when damaging or defeating enemies or taking damage, and there are multiple divine beasts that you unlock as you progress through the campaign, and each one has some kind of offensive or defensive ability you can trigger, be it a large AoE effect or just summoning the divine beast itself to aid you in battle and deal massive damage as an AI companion, and more. Speaking of AI companions, you can also recruit squad members who will fight alongside you and grant you buffs, and these are going to be famous warriors and historical figures you meet throughout the campaign who will essentially join your party, if you will, and you can summon up to 2 at a time, or rather, some companions will have a sub-companion with them, and they have their own leveling system, oath levels, which, if you increase, will unlock new ally buffs and effects. Maximizing their oath level will give you their unique weapons, and more often than not, each mission will introduce a historical figure, a character who will tag along with you. But if you want to challenge yourself, or if you find the AI companion to be a little disruptive to your gameplay experience, you can use an item called Willow Branch to dismiss the squad member and tackle the game by yourself and make it more of that purist Soulsborne Sekiro experience. It's going to be more challenging. Now, companions don't have to be AI. You can do co-op with other players. You can also invade other player sessions. And there's this avenging mechanic in this game where you'll see these flags with a purple aura, markers for players who died by a certain enemy. And if you kill that enemy, you'll avenge the player, and that'll just give you rewards and higher item drop rates. From what I can tell, there's no messaging system, but this is Wolong's version of that sort of asynchronous online mode that Soulsborne games tend to have. Other familiar Soulsborne/Sekiro-like elements include the Dragon's Cure Pot, which is basically Wolong's version of the Estus. These are limited use heals that you can only recharge by reaching the next checkpoint, by resting at a bonfire, or Wolong's equivalent of the bonfire. Though over time, as you progress through the campaign, the number of uses per run can be increased, and the potency of the heal can be increased by finding the upgrade items that are hidden throughout the nooks and crannies of the game's various environments. You also have consumable items a la Soulsborne/Sekiro, things like chi clots that essentially give you souls that you don't drop when you die, so these can be useful if you just need a little extra push of extra souls or extra chi to be able to level up at a checkpoint. You can use consumable healing items, status removal items, throwable offensive items, items that, take you back to the last bonfire, certain items that tie into the game's systems and mechanics, online mode, and whatnot. I've already mentioned the bonfire equivalent of Wolong. In this game, they're called battle flags that you raise, the equivalent of lighting bonfires. They serve as checkpoints to rest, to level up, to travel to other areas or past missions. to save and load equipment presets, to set spells and divine beasts before you head out, to essentially customize your loadout, to buy and sell items, and more. But others actually are guarded by leader enemies who must be defeated first before you're able to raise those flags. And like in Soulsborne, resting at a battle flag or resting at the bonfire equivalent in Wolong will respawn the enemies around you and act as the checkpoints to which you'll return to when you die. So it's about making that forward push towards the next checkpoint, learning the enemies and levels that'll serve as obstacles towards that next checkpoint, and you keep pushing until you get to a boss and progress the campaign by defeating them. Speaking of bosses, there's some really great boss battles in this game. Just really awesome designs, really cool movesets, some great variety in boss types and combat scenarios. They're just really engaging, intense, challenging, and satisfying to defeat. I just wish equal consideration was given to the non-boss enemies that roam around the game world. While there is a good amount of boss variety, there's definitely a lack of enemy variety. It just nowhere touches what Soulsborne, Sekiro, or Elden Ring achieve on that front. The enemies that roam the world are still fun and tense to fight. Even basic enemies can kick your ass if you're careless. And there are definitely some cool and interesting encounter designs and enemy placements, but you're going to be fighting a lot of the same enemies for the majority of the campaign, which is a little disappointing. Fortunately, there is a good amount of variety when it comes to environments, biomes, missions, and levels. The game world is not interconnected like Soulsborne or Sekiro. The game is essentially mission-based. Biomes are separate from each other, and you can travel between these levels at any time with the battle flags or bonfires fast travel function, but you're essentially selecting a stage, an area, a level to go to. And among these is this hub area called the Hidden Village, and that's where you'll find many of the key NPCs like the blacksmith or the guy who will allow you to access character creation at any time and things like that. And some of these NPCs might actually give you some small optional side quests that you can partake in for rewards. While the lack of interconnectedness makes the level design of Wolong nowhere near as memorable as From Software titles, the level design is still pretty good, and each mission / area / level / biome is actually pretty sizable, and their formats are pretty varied too. Some are pretty linear, others are fairly open with various paths, others are straight up just like battlefields that you have to make your way through. And many of these levels loop back around through clever shortcuts. Some areas have a lot of space and verticality with engaging enemy placement to strategize and to plan around. And on top of that, there are plenty of nooks and crannies that you can explore for hidden, valuable loot that incentivizes exploration. Another great mechanic that further encourages exploration is the morale system. So morale is essentially a separate leveling system. When you start a new mission or when you reach a new biome, your morale starts at 0, and you gain morale by defeating enemies, and you can usually go up to like morale level 20 per mission, and when you die, your morale will be lost. And enemies also have morale, and the way it works is that enemies with higher morale than you will be harder to kill, will do more damage, and those with lower morale than you will be easier to kill, will deal less damage. And if your morale is about the same to an enemy you're encountering, usually that means you're evenly matched. It is possible to kill enemies that have much higher morale than you. I've done it, but they can one or two shot you, so you got to be very careful and very skilled with your parries to overcome those kinds of challenges. Now, the floor of your morale level can be increased via something called Fortitude. Fortitude represents the minimum morale you'll have at any given time. So when you die, your morale level will be brought back down to your Fortitude level. And the way you gain Fortitude is by raising flags. I talked about the battle flags, which are your bonfires, your checkpoints. Those will raise your Fortitude, but also scattered throughout the world are these marking flags that are optional. These are non-bonfire flags that you activate specifically to increase your Fortitude, and these marking flags are kind of scattered about. Some are pretty easy to spot, but others are decently well hidden, and that forces you to kind of explore the open world so that you can find all of these marking flags, so you can raise your morale and be evenly matched against enemies in later parts of an area who will have higher morale, or the boss who will have a pretty high morale. If you find all of the battle and marking flags in a mission, you'll usually be evenly matched against the boss. So this is a cool system that allows you to even the odds, that allows you to make forward progress in each mission that encourages exploration, but also allows you to, customize the difficulty of a mission. It's also a great way to reward players who are doing really well and aren't dying, because not dying means that as you keep defeating enemies, your morale goes past your fortitude, and you can overshoot by quite a bit and really become quite powerful. So it's this like vicious cycle, but if you get careless, your morale gets brought back down to your fortitude level. So yeah, it's a nice mechanic that just keeps things interesting as you complete a mission. Finding these marking flags just makes exploration rewarding, and exploring also will lead you to finding valuable loot, be it rare weapons and armor, or rare items and crafting materials, cool little mini bosses that are hidden throughout, so on and so forth. It's also fun to explore because the game has this really great art style. While the graphics fidelity definitely does look dated, the aesthetic of the game is oftentimes mesmerizing and varied. There are a lot of cool Chinese mythology and history visual motifs that are used to great effect. Just lots of great looking environments and vistas to take in. That makes it visually pleasing to explore all of the different biomes and areas and missions. Music is also tastefully implemented, just very appropriate feeling for this historical Chinese setting. The music does a really good job of both setting the mood for moments of mysticism and moments of high intensity. Now, the biggest issue that I encountered with this game was its performance. There were just a lot of stutters throughout my playthrough during gameplay and cutscenes. And for a game that demands this much precision and timing for parrying and deflection, this is severely detrimental. There were often times where I died because of a micro stutter that happened while I was parrying, and so the timing got thrown off. And there were occasions where the game would be frozen for a couple seconds or for like a quick minute, which was very disruptive. I'd have to sit there and twiddle my thumbs until the game decided to essentially resume. One time the game just froze completely and crashed, and I lost a decent amount of progress when that happened because the autosave in this game isn't quite as good as the FromSoft games. But I will say this, after a 20 gigabyte patch that dropped on February 28th, performance just got a whole lot better. Now I'm experiencing little to no stutters and no freezes of any kind, so by the time you play this game with the final release, these performance issues might have been addressed. Hopefully your experience won't suffer from that with this 20 gigabyte patch. And then one last thing I want to talk about is story, which I found to be one of the weaker aspects of this game. The general story involves these warring factions and this mystical drug called the elixir that turns men into beasts, and you're charged with essentially quelling evil plots surrounding these elements in this multifaceted conflict. It's just a lot of like awkwardly placed expositional cutscenes, not a terribly compelling plot, not many memorable character interactions. There's some cool world building, and it is cool to see famous historical and mythological figures as allies and or enemy bosses, but overall the narrative and characters in this game never held my attention or compelled me. They're kind of there to just move you from mission to mission. I don't feel like the story is going to be the reason you're going to be playing this game. The one thing I'd recommend you do is changing the voiceover language to Chinese, because that really did help with the immersion. It was just a lot more appropriate. Though that does mean you're going to be relying on subtitles a lot, and if subtitles aren't your thing, then you'll just want to play with the English dub.
As long as we have you, victory is still possible. Consider that a talisman of protection.
But yeah, the story in this game is told in a very straightforward manner. It's not like FromSoftware titles where you kind of have to look for the story and the world building and the lore and all these things. So there isn't as much of a sense of mystery and narrative discovery as those FromSoftware titles. And that'd be fine if the story was actually really good, the straightforward storytelling was actually compelling, but I just don't find that to be the case. It's just like oddly paced, weirdly exposition, and just not particularly compelling in my experience, at least. This is definitely one of those games that's carried by its gameplay, especially the combat, which is excellent. This is a game that I just could not put down, especially as a lover of Sekiro. Combat in particular is just fun, intense, engaging, challenging, and addictive. There's a great sense of progression and customization overall. Bosses are freaking awesome, and there's some cool missions and areas. Even with its flaws, this is overall a truly worthy Sekiro-like, just a great alternative to the game it took inspiration from that's both familiar and yet unique in its own right. just as an avid Sekiro lover, Wolong was right up my alley, and in some ways it's more accessible than Sekiro, so I think some people might have an easier time getting into this game. There's just more gameplay flexibility that might appeal to folks who maybe weren't a fan of just how strict Sekiro was in forcing you to play one specific way. But yeah, with all said and done, had a fantastic time with Wolong, and this is a fairly lengthy game. The average that the developers relayed was like 40 hours. I'm about 2/3 of the way now, but I just want to keep playing further. I'm actually like, I'm feeling the draw of this game. I'm feeling like addicted to this game where I just want to keep coming back to it every day. But yeah, there you have it, folks. That's my review of Wolong Fallen Dynasty. I hope this video was informative and helps you make a purchase decision. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this game if you've played it already, and what your general take is on this title based on the information relayed in this review. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.